That night, Liam returned to his gang, unaware that the hunter had already begun to set subtle warnings. The quiet town of Manchester, so peaceful for so long, was about to witness a clash unlike anything it had seen before, where cunning, patience, and experience would collide with arrogance, violence, and greed. The game had begun, and the old hunter had the first move. Liam's gang had begun to establish themselves on the edge of the forest, bringing trucks, tents, and heavy equipment into what had once been a peaceful, untouched land. The night air was thick with the scent of smoke and fuel, and the rumble of engines echoed unnaturally against the stillness of the woods. The villagers noticed the strange lights flickering among the trees, the sudden movement of men and machines where only wildlife had roamed before. Anxiety spread quietly, but no one dared to confront the newcomers. Liam, confident in his reputation, assumed that fear alone would keep the locals in line. One evening, driven by curiosity and arrogance, Liam decided to explore deeper into the forest, further than he had dared to venture before. He moved through the shadows, stepping carefully over roots and underbrush, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of resistance. That was when he first saw the cabin, small and unassuming, almost swallowed by the dense foliage. It looked fragile, abandoned even, and Liam's lips curled into a smirk. But Ethan Rourke had already seen him. From a hidden vantage point high among the trees, the old hunter's eyes followed every movement of Liam and his gang. To outsiders, he might have seemed frail and quiet, a man past his prime, but in reality, he was a master of patience and strategy. He had spent years preparing for moments like this, moments when intruders might threaten the peace he had built in solitude. Every fallen branch, every disturbed animal trail, every shadow was a tool he could use to defend his territory. As Liam approached the cabin, he could feel the oppressive silence of the forest, though he interpreted it as emptiness, not danger. He walked confidently, even as the underbrush seemed unnaturally still. His footsteps were the only sound, and for a moment it seemed the forest itself was holding its breath. Liam's arrogance blinded him to the subtle signs that something was watching, waiting, calculating. He glanced around, seeing nothing but trees and darkness, and laughed at the thought that an old man could oppose him. Ethan began setting subtle warnings that night. He moved silently around the perimeter, leaving signs that were small but unnerving. A snapped branch here, a pile of rocks carefully arranged there, footprints that seemed to circle back on themselves. Liam's gang noticed these disturbances the following morning. Supplies were slightly shifted, paths disrupted, and the subtle sense of being watched began to gnaw at their confidence. The tension in the forest grew. Liam, confident yet increasingly uneasy, began to realize that this was not like any territory he had claimed before. Something in the stillness of the woods suggested a presence far more calculating than he had anticipated. While he saw only a frail old man, the forest whispered of an unseen force, a strategy that moved with precision and patience. And for the first time, Liam felt that the conquest he had assumed would be simple might not be so easy after all. A few nights after the initial warnings, Liam's gang returned to the edge of the forest, determined to establish a permanent camp. Confidence masked their unease, but beneath it, a subtle tension had begun to grow. The first night had been quiet, and Liam had brushed off the small disturbances as minor annoyances, perhaps even the work of rival gangs. The forest was eerily silent. No animals stirred, no leaves rustled beyond the wind. Even the occasional owl seemed to have vanished. Liam interpreted this stillness as weakness, an invitation to assert his dominance. Unbeknownst to him, Ethan Rourke had been watching for hours. When they reached a clearing, they found something that made their blood run cold. Their vehicles had been tampered with. Tires were slashed, chains cut, and their equipment rendered useless. The gang froze, staring at the wreckage. The calculated sabotage was subtle, efficient, and terrifying. No one had seen Ethan. No one had heard him. Yet his message was clear. This land was not theirs. Yet as they departed, the forest seemed to whisper, carrying a warning they did not fully understand. Each step into the woods brought them closer to a confrontation they were unprepared for, against a man who knew every shadow, every path, and every secret that the forest could hold. Liam had assumed that this would be easy, that fear alone would bend the old hunter to his will. Equipment destroyed, paths blocked, and constant signs of being watched had left them on edge. Liam decided that subtlety was no longer an option. He brought in heavy machinery, thinking the noise and intimidation would break any resistance. Ethan Rourke, from the safety of his hidden vantage points, observed every movement with calm precision. He had spent a lifetime reading the land, understanding the way shadows could hide a trap, how sounds could mislead, and how the forest could be shaped into a labyrinth for anyone who dared enter it uninvited. At one point, Liam's men wandered into a foggy section of the forest, only to find themselves circling the same clearing repeatedly. Disorientation turned to panic as the realization dawned. The forest itself seemed alive, working against them. By the end of the week, Liam's confidence had begun to waver. Liam's gang, once fearless and proud, now began to understand that they were not the hunters. They were the hunted. The forest had grown darker and more oppressive as Liam's gang pressed further into Ethan's territory. Each day, their confidence eroded a little more, replaced by unease that no one dared to speak aloud. The vehicles they had brought in to assert control now sat idle, damaged and unusable. Tools were missing or broken, tents had been torn apart in the night, and supplies seemed to vanish as if the forest itself were swallowing them. Whispers of fear spread quietly among the men, though Liam tried to maintain his usual bravado. He had faced danger before, he reminded himself, but something about this land felt different, alive in a way that resisted his presence. Then, one morning, panic erupted. One of Liam's men, a younger recruit named Callum, had disappeared. His bedroll was untouched, and his footprints led toward a section of dense underbrush, but there was no trace of a struggle. No one could explain where he had gone. Liam's frustration turned to anger. He scoured the forest, calling out, firing warning shots into the air, but there was no response. The remaining gang members began to tremble, the first seeds of true fear taking root. Ethan had executed the disappearance with precision. Using a hidden pit that he had carefully concealed with branches and leaves, Callum had fallen silently, trapped but unharmed. Ethan's strategy was never to kill unnecessarily. His goal was to instill fear, to demonstrate control without revealing himself directly. He watched from a distance as the young man struggled, panicked, and called for help, all while remaining invisible. The forest amplified Callum's every sound, making the situation feel far worse than it actually was. By the time the others found him hours later, exhausted and terrified, he had been moved silently to the edge of the woods, shaken beyond belief. Liam tried to rationalize what had happened. He told himself it was a prank, the work of rival gangs, or perhaps even an accident. But deep down, he knew that no one could have orchestrated such a precise disappearance without planning and knowledge of the land that went far beyond ordinary skill. His confidence, which had carried him through countless confrontations, began to crumble. He realized that the forest was no longer a backdrop. It was a weapon, and the man who wielded it had decades of mastery. The gang's morale collapsed. Men whispered in corners, glancing nervously into the trees, jumpy at every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig. Even Liam, usually unshakable, felt the creeping grip of doubt. He had assumed that fear and violence would bend any opponent, but he had underestimated the cunning of an old hunter who knew every path, every shadow, every hidden corner of the land. Ethan remained invisible, calm, and methodical. Every movement of the gang was observed and countered. Every attempt they made to intimidate him had been rendered useless. In this quiet, strategic war, the old hunter held the advantage. Liam's gang had believed they were in control, but the first real test had proven otherwise. The disappearance of Callum was a message, clear and terrifying. This land was not theirs, and any further intrusion would come at a cost far higher than they could imagine. By nightfall, the forest returned to its silent watch, shadows deepening, and the wind whispering through the trees as if carrying a warning. Liam knew that the rules had changed. The hunter had made his first strike, and now fear was beginning to spread in a way that no amount of violence could erase. The game was no longer about domination. It was about survival, and the old hunter had just shown that he always played to win. By the time Liam realized the true extent of the threat, it was almost too late. A forest had become a maze, each path leading the gang deeper into confusion, every shadow hiding unseen dangers. Liam, usually fearless and brash, felt a creeping unease as he watched his men stumble through the underbrush, their nerves fraying with every misstep. The once confident swagger that had carried him through London now faltered. For the first time, he understood that this was no ordinary opponent. The old hunter was not just defending his land. He was orchestrating it, turning every element of the forest into a weapon. Determined to assert control, Liam decided to confront the old man directly. He moved cautiously, leading his men through the thickest part of the forest, guns in hand, eyes scanning every shadow. He expected the cabin to be the center of resistance, the place where Ethan would make a stand. But the further he went, the more the forest seemed to betray him. Paths curved back on themselves. Familiar landmarks appeared in the wrong places, and sounds echoed in ways that made his instincts scream that something was wrong. Every step felt deliberate, as if the forest itself were moving against him. Ethan had prepared for this confrontation with meticulous care. He had anticipated the gang's patterns, predicting their every move, and had set traps that would confuse, mislead, and frighten them. Rocks were positioned to fall at precise moments, creating sudden crashes that made the intruders jump. Roots in hidden pits disrupted their footing, while branches swung at head height, forcing men to duck and stumble. The sounds of movement in the trees, the rustle of leaves in the wind, and faint noises from unseen places combined to create the illusion that the forest was alive and hunting them. As the gang advanced, confusion turned to panic. Men shouted to each other, trying to stay together, but every attempt only seemed to scatter them further. Liam, frustrated and desperate, tried to regain control, but the forest itself was working against him. Each man became isolated, separated by the darkness and Ethan's silent manipulations. The realization hit Liam with chilling clarity. He was no longer the predator. He had become prey in the hands of a man who understood the land in a way he never could. Hours passed in this nightmarish maze. The gang, once brash and confident, was exhausted, disoriented, and terrified. Liam's anger boiled, but he had no clear target. Every move he made seemed anticipated, every plan countered before it could take shape. He began to understand the true skill of the hunter: patience. Ethan did not rush or attack violently. He let fear grow organically, letting his enemies destroy themselves against invisible obstacles, all while remaining unseen. By dawn, Liam's men were battered, shaken, and demoralized. Some had tried to escape, only to be rerouted subtly by the forest, finding themselves back where they began. The old hunter had proven that physical strength and weapons were meaningless in the face of experience, patience, and cunning. Liam, exhausted and humiliated, realized that the forest belonged to Ethan. Every step forward had been anticipated, and every misstep was part of a plan that he could neither see nor understand. The old hunter remained a shadow in the trees, silent and invisible. Liam's arrogance had led him into a trap he could not fight, and the forest had claimed victory for the first time. In the stillness that followed, The lesson was clear. Survival depended not on violence, but on respect for a man who knew every secret the land could hold. Liam had reached the point of exhaustion, both physically and mentally. The forest had turned against him, and each attempt to assert control only pushed him further into confusion and fear. He knew the old hunter was watching, guiding the forest itself to disrupt every step he took. Still, arrogance and desperation drove him forward. He had to confront Ethan directly. He had to prove that he was in charge, or at least convince himself that he could. The cabin appeared suddenly through the thick trees, almost as if it had been hidden until the perfect moment. Liam expected an old man, frail and helpless, someone to intimidate and push out of the way. But the moment he stepped closer, the forest seemed to shift around him, every sound amplified, every shadow lengthened. The air was thick with tension, the kind that made even a seasoned criminal hesitate. He reached the cabin door, expecting resistance, but there was none. Silence greeted him, deeper than any night he had ever known. Ethan had prepared meticulously. The cabin was a maze of subtle traps, hidden alarms, and decoys designed to confuse any intruder. The floor shifted slightly underfoot, not enough to be immediately noticeable, but enough to throw off balance. Rocks and branches were positioned to fall or snap at precise moments, producing loud crashes that disoriented the intruder. Every step Liam took seemed anticipated, every move countered by invisible forces. He could feel the hunter's presence without seeing him, a quiet, cold awareness that made every nerve in his body tense. As Liam stepped inside, the floor gave way beneath him, and he plunged into a hidden pit. He hit the ground hard, the impact jolting him, and for the first time in his life, he felt powerless. Above him, unseen, Ethan stood calmly, observing every reaction. There was no rush, no anger, only calculated patience. Liam had always believed that intimidation, violence, and speed were the keys to dominance, but Ethan had shown him that true power lay in knowledge, preparation, and control. The pit was designed not to kill, but to immobilize, to force reflection. Liam struggled, realizing that brute force alone could not overcome this man, who had spent decades mastering every inch of his domain. Outside, the forest remained alive with movement, sounds, and distractions, amplifying the gangster's confusion. Every attempt to escape only proved the hunter's mastery further. Liam's mind raced, understanding too late that he had underestimated an opponent whose patience and strategy far exceeded his own. Hours passed, each moment stretching endlessly. Liam's confidence, once unshakable, had evaporated entirely. The realization sank in that Ethan had dismantled his gang without a single bullet fired, without showing himself. Every trap, every subtle disruption, every psychological tactic had worked flawlessly. The hunter had won not through violence, but through cunning, precision, and the intimate knowledge of his land. By the time Liam was finally removed from the pit and brought back to the edge of the forest, he was a changed man. Exhausted, humiliated, and broken, he could only stare at the dense trees that had held him captive. The old hunter remained unseen, a ghost in his domain, yet his power was unmistakable. Liam had invaded the forest, thinking he would dominate, but the truth was clear. He had been bested by a man whose patience, skill, and cunning were far deadlier than any weapon. The lesson was seared into him forever. This was Ethan's land, and those who trespassed did so at their own peril. The forest returned to its quiet, almost serene state after the chaos that had overtaken it for weeks. The villagers noticed the sudden stillness, the absence of trucks, the lack of strange lights and noises, but they did not know the true story. The forest had claimed victory in silence, and the man who had orchestrated it remained hidden, a ghost whose presence was felt but never seen. Liam the Blade, Carver had been humbled, stripped of his arrogance, and left to carry the memory of his defeat into the outside world. Liam was found wandering near the edge of the forest, exhausted, disoriented, and broken in spirit. His gang had scattered, some fleeing in terror, others too afraid to return. The authorities eventually apprehended him, and though he faced charges for trespassing and illegal activities, the full truth of what had happened in the forest remained a secret. Liam could not fully explain the terror, the invisible force that had dismantled his gang without a single bullet fired directly by Ethan. It was a lesson in fear, patience, and the deadly mastery of one man over the land he called home. The villagers, while unaware of the precise details, whispered of an old hunter who still watched from the shadows, a man whose life in the forest had made him untouchable. Stories spread quietly of strange occurrences, men and machines disappearing, and shadows that moved without explanation. Some speculated that Ethan was more than human, a mythic figure who commanded the forest itself. The truth was simpler yet far more terrifying. He was a man who had honed his instincts, learned every inch of his territory, and could predict the actions of intruders before they even occurred. Ethan, for his part, returned to his routines, seemingly unbothered by the events that had unfolded. He moved through the forest with the same quiet precision as always, setting traps for animals, checking paths, and ensuring that his territory remained secure. To any observer, he was just an old man living alone, but the lessons of the past weeks had made it clear that beneath that calm exterior was a mind sharper than any weapon, a strategist who could dismantle even the most dangerous adversaries with patience and cunning. Liam's defeat became a cautionary tale, first among his own criminal networks, then spreading more widely. The story of the gangster who underestimated an old hunter in the outskirts of Manchester was told with a mixture of fear and awe. It served as a warning that strength and violence alone were meaningless without knowledge, strategy, and respect for those who had mastered their environment. The forest remained unchanged in appearance, but its reputation had shifted. Trespassers were now viewed with suspicion, and the villagers understood that some lands were not to be claimed lightly. The story of the old hunter and the arrogant gangster lingered in the town like a shadow, a reminder that the quietest men could wield the greatest power, and the most unassuming places could hold deadly secrets. In the end, Liam had learned the hard way that arrogance and brutality could never triumph over wisdom, patience, and experience. The forest belonged to Ethan Rourke, and anyone foolish enough to challenge him would meet the same fate: lost, disoriented, and forever changed. The quiet town returned to normal, but beneath its peaceful exterior, the memory of the old hunter's deadly mastery lingered, an invisible force shaping the lives of those who lived nearby. No one forgot the lesson. The deadliest predator was not the man with the gun, but the man who knew his land better than anyone else.